Senator Barrasso.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'd first like to take a moment to speak on S-2446, introduced by Senator Hoeven and Manchin. My home state of Wyoming is a coal state. The issue of regulating the byproduct of burning coal is a very important issue to my constituents. The EPA decided, after public comment, that regulating this byproduct as hazardous waste was the wrong approach to storing coal ash. The EPA decided it was better to regulate it as a solid waste, and I agree. There is clearly need for legislation on this issue. As written testimony before us today spells out, without legislation, there would likely be conflicts between state programs and the EPA rule. So I commend Senators Hoeven and Manchin for trying to solve this issue. As the bill continues to move forward, I want to ensure that states have the certainty that they need that the EPA won't move the goalposts or impose unnecessary criteria in the face of legitimate state plans that are based on sound science. So I want to work with the bill sponsors, members of the committee, and you, Mr. Chairman, to ensure that the states are adequately protected in this legislation, which leads me to my question for Mr. Merriman. In written testimony by some other witnesses here today and by outside groups who oppose the legislation, there's a constant theme that seems to be appearing. The theme is that somehow states aren't up to the task of protecting communities, and that by giving states more control over addressing coal ash storage, we're somehow taking power away from local communities. I believe it was Mr. Holloman who was shaking his head yes, who said in his written testimony that this takes power away from local communities and gives it to state bureaucracies. So my question is, if we give EPA all the power to address coal ash, how does that not take power away from local communities and simply just give it to Washington?
And I think the Chairman actually brought that point up too, Senator. It is, in our particular situation, nice that we're responsible to the community that we serve. It's also important that we work with the state. It is a lot easier for the taxpayers and the citizens of Florida, as an example, to come to downtown Orlando than it is to go to Tallahassee for public hearings and for some requirements, or to get to the Washington offices in order to make these, or even Atlanta for our Region 4. We very much listen to our citizens and our communities, and it's a very important part of how we do business. We also work very closely with the state as they do regulations so that there is not just consistency, but there's flexibility, which is a part of the preamble of this particular rule. But we work with the flexibility in that to make sure that those rules are applied with the flexibility on a site-by-site basis. Hydrology is not the same in every state, not within every state, and this allows us to write almost a prescriptive way to do the best we can to protect our resources.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Ms. Krill, I would like to just talk about the record of this administration's EPA for a moment, especially when it relates to addressing the needs of local communities impacted by the Gold King Mine Animas River spill. Yesterday, there was an opinion piece in a national paper written by Ryan Flynn, who is New Mexico's Secretary of the Environment. And he wrote about the EPA's response to the spill. The piece was entitled, "Downstream from a Slippery EPA." This is from the New Mexico Secretary of Environment. He states, about 2 weeks after the spill, the EPA released an environmental standard for the Gold King mine sediment that was an order of magnitude weaker than those applied to other polluters. So the EPA sets a standard for itself weaker than those applied to other polluters. He went on to say, even months later, although the EPA yellow water has passed, the EPA's data shows that storms have disturbed contaminated sediment, have pushed lead levels back above the tolerance for safe drinking water. So as the Secretary of New Mexico Secretary of Environment of New Mexico points out, EPA persisted in claiming, in spite of that the watershed had returned to pre-spill conditions. And he said, look, careful campaign, this has been a careful campaign of minimization and misdirection by the EPA. This is the Secretary of Environment for New Mexico. So as you mentioned in your written testimony, the EPA is responsible for the spill. And it appears that they're not protecting the local communities and the tribes dependent on this water, but are instead misinforming the public about the health hazards to protect themselves. So my question is, what is your opinion of EPA's record with regard to this spill, and do you support empowering the states and others with the tools necessary to solve these and other environmental problems rather than empowering the EPA that has this level, which to me seems irresponsible? I mean, that's the question regarding how they appeal to how they run things versus what they make others do.
Well,
thank you for the question. I have not read the op-ed that you mentioned, so I can go back and review that later. We do support empowering the states through reforming the mining law of 1872, which would create a reclamation fee and a fund that would then be distributed by the states in order to manage cleanups of these technically complicated sites. If 1872 mining law reform had passed when it was first introduced in 1993 or any time subsequent from then the EPA wouldn't have been on site doing the job that it was doing in the headwaters of the Animas River.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Barrasso.